There is no solution except by jihad. In a story that the mainstream media would never touch, alternative news websites are touting words of miracles in the skies over Israel. It started in a newspaper called the Jewish Telegraph. The headline read, "Their God changes the path of our rockets in midair," said a terrorist. Now, that's not a headline you see every day. The article said, one of the terrorists from Gaza was reported to say, when asked why they couldn't aim their rockets more effectively, "We do aim them, but their God changes their path in midair." Now, that's an amazing thing to see in print, but in a court of law, it would be called hearsay evidence. Still, it raises a fascinating question. Why haven't there been more casualties in Israel during the current conflict with Hamas? Most would say the credit should go to the Iron Dome, a miracle of modern science that strikes down 90% of missiles it targets. But national security specialist David Axe doesn't believe the 90% number. For Reuters, he wrote, "Israel's vaunted Iron Dome defense system is more like an iron sieve. It fails to destroy all but a few of the rockets that Hamas and other Palestinian militant groups fire at Israeli communities." Even if Iron Dome's success rate really is 90%, that leaves a failure rate of 10%. Admittedly, the Hamas missile men are not the best. Their failed rockets have hit Al-Shifa Hospital, Al-Shati refugee camp, and other places inside of Gaza. Of course, compliant reporters at the hospital scene immediately blamed Israel for both events. Once the truth came out that the missiles did not come from Israel, but Hamas, very few corrected their original error, of course. All of this might lead you to believe that the 10% that got through just happened to miss populated areas. But the fact is, Iron Dome only targets missiles with a trajectory and velocity that will take them into populated or strategic areas of Israel. So if Iron Dome actually missed 10% of the missiles that are headed directly for populated areas, why haven't there been more casualties in Israel? Well, whether he's changing the path of Hamas rockets in midair or something else, I believe the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob really is at work. There's an Iron Dome battery commander who believes it, too. This commander told an Israeli news site, "We fired the first interceptor. It missed. Second, it missed. This is very rare. I was in shock. At this point, we had just 4 seconds until the missile lands. We had already notified emergency services to converge on the target location and had warned of a mass casualty incident. Suddenly, Iron Dome, which calculates wind speeds among other things, shows a major wind coming from the east, a strong wind that sends the missile into the sea. We were all stunned. I stood up and shouted, 'There's a God.' I witnessed this miracle with my own eyes. It was not told or reported to me. I saw the hand of God send that missile into the sea." The Bible never says that reborn Israel would have an easy time. In fact, it warns of extremely rough roads ahead. A missile might at some point in the future strike Israel in a vulnerable area. But in this round of fighting so far, against all odds, none have. Several Mideast observers in the last few days, however, have analyzed Israel's situation and concluded that it is hopeless. British Prime Minister David Cameron said, "We need a genuine peace deal between the Palestinians and the Israelis, and my worry is that the more this is put off, the more impossible it becomes." Alex Massey wrote in the British magazine, The Spectator, "Even Gaza is just a bloody sideshow tangential. Despite its horrors, to the real and horrendous question that loom large in Israel's future. The occupation is unsustainable, so is everything else. It doesn't matter whose fault it just is. It's a zero-sum game with no winners, but in which Israel risks losing more than its opponents. There they stand, and there they can do no other, even though they know it cannot be anything like enough. Hopeless in Gaza and Jerusalem alike. It seems hopeless because to the unbelieving observer, Israel makes no sense. To them, it's like putting Cessna wings on a bulldozer and expecting it to fly. It can't, and yet, in Israel's case, it does. Israel is a miracle nation. It started with the miracle of a man having faith and God counting it as righteousness. When that man was 100 years old, he had a child with his 90-year-old wife. The miracle child of promise, Isaac, along with his father Abraham, would be remembered as patriarchs of the nation. A series of miracles took Joseph to Egypt, where he was able to save his brothers, and with them, the future nation. Another series of miracles spared Moses' life and allowed him to bring the nation out of Egypt, and along the way, walked through the Red Sea on dry ground. In a July 4th op-ed piece for Israel's Arutz Sheva, Dr. Ina Ragachi wrote, "The Jewish nation's existence for 6 millennia is a miracle. There is no single Jewish life without a miracle. Miracle is an essential part of our belief. It is a gem of Jewish folklore. It is a source of our hope in the dark. And it's a gift of our dreams. And we know why. Because these miracles are true." I've recounted many times the miracles that kept the Jewish people distinct despite being taken from their homeland, dispersed around the world, and left in these various places for generations. I've referred often to the colossal miracles that it took to bring them back to their ancient land, restore them as a nation, and then regain sovereign control of Jerusalem for the first time in 2,500 years. All just as God had promised. But when all this began to happen back in 1948, it wasn't happily ever after. Observers around the world shook their heads and said, it can never survive. Israel's continuing survival remains humanly impossible. However, when dealing with Israel, one has to begin with the presumption that it's impossible. God set up Israel's history so that it would drive millions to come to see that with God, all things are possible. I featured these miraculous phenomena in my book, The Late Great Planet Earth, and it helped bring millions to believe in Jesus Christ as Savior. During the intervening years, many powerful nations have been arrayed against this teeny country, and the world at large has increasingly turned against it. Indeed, Israel's birth was a miracle. Then came the miracle of its rebirth and the blooming of the desert like a rose. Its continued existence remains a miracle. And in numbers like never before, Israelis are beginning to see it and believe their prophets. The miracles have made existence possible, but they haven't guaranteed an easy life. Modern Israel's back has been against the wall since it came into existence. When it fights to live, to survive. In 1969 interview with Life magazine, Golda Meir put it well. "We have always said that in our war with the Arabs, we had a secret weapon. No alternative. The Egyptians could run to Egypt. The Syrians could run back to Syria. The only place we could run was into the sea. And before we did that, we might as well fight." In that same interview, Meir told Life, "It is true, we have won all our wars, but we have paid for them. We don't want victories anymore. That is the heart of the Israeli people. They've been fighting every step of the way. They're tired of it. They don't want to fight anymore. But everything and everyone else has failed them. NBC News reported last week that the peace movement in Israel has largely collapsed. They gave peace a chance, and then they did it again and again and again. So far, it hasn't worked. Every move toward peace by Israel has been interpreted as weakness by Hamas and the Palestinians. New polling now shows that 95% of the Jews in Israel support the current action against Hamas. They have no place to run, but they haven't given up. We live in troubled times, but for the student of Bible prophecy, that comes as no surprise. In general, things in the world will get worse until they get better, much worse. Then suddenly, much, much better. But in the meantime, all God's promises to you and me as Christians remain intact. He still tells us not to fear. He's still with us, still loves us, and promised us to always be with us in every trial we may face. We now see all the predicted signs of Christ coming right before us. So believe this promise. Jesus said, when these things begin to take place, stand up, lift up your heads, because your redemption is drawing near. Folks, as dangerous as the terror tunnels and missiles of Hamas may be, there's another far greater danger lurking to Israel's north. There are reports that Hezbollah, headquartered in Lebanon and much more dangerous than Hamas, is building a similar network of tunnels beneath Israel's northern border. For years, Israeli residents close to the border have reported hearing odd noises under schools and other buildings. Now we know what they may have been hearing. Hezbollah is supported by and closely allied with Iran and serves its proxy throughout the world. Hezbollah also poses a direct threat to the United States. I'll discuss this peril in more detail next week, but look out that there may be tunnels on the southern border of the United States. In the meantime, pray earnestly for Israel. God's people have never been in more danger than they are at this moment. That's it for tonight. God willing, I'll see you next week.
You've been watching the Hal Lindsey Report. To support this program, send your tax-deductible gift to Hal Lindsey Media Ministries, P.O. Box 470-470, Tulsa, Oklahoma 74147. You can also support this ministry online. Visit hallindsey.com or call 1-888-RAPTURE.